I don't know what possessed me to go alone that day, setting off for a secluded fishing spot near Shillong without even the reassurance of company. Maybe it was the restless city life that had gotten to me, or maybe I just needed the quiet, one night to myself, with only the sounds of the river to keep me company. It was midday when I packed my gear and left, the sun high and reassuring in the sky as I made my way toward the spot I'd heard about, a place where the fish practically threw themselves onto your line. By the time I arrived, it was around 4 p.m., and the sky had started to dull, the clouds rolling in heavier than I'd anticipated. The river lay stretched out before me, a quiet, winding ribbon of water with thick woods on the other side. I took in the sight of the towering trees swaying in the breeze and the murky calm of the water. It was all so surreal and quiet, a world apart from everything else. Setting up my tent along the riverbank, I cast my line into the river and fished for an hour or so, managing to pull in just enough for a decent dinner. With fish in hand and a small fire crackling, I figured this would be the peaceful break I'd needed. Little did I know how very wrong I was. As evening set in, the skies finally opened up, and a light drizzle began to fall. I huddled under the shelter I'd set up beside my tent, watching the rain pepper the surface of the river as the last remnants of daylight vanished. The wind picked up, whistling softly through the trees across the water, adding to the eerie calm of the night. I cooked my catch, savoring the simple meal, and for a brief moment I let my guard down, lulled by the river's gentle flow and the soft patter of rain. But as the night deepened, I felt it. A shift in the air. The usual nighttime sounds faded until all I could hear was the wind brushing through the leaves. It was as though the entire forest had gone quiet, holding its breath. Restless, I decided to fish a little longer, hoping to relax. I cast my line again, watching the faint ripples as I waited, my thoughts wandering. Then, out of nowhere, a sound pierced the stillness. A growl. Low, guttural, and impossibly close, coming from somewhere across the river. I froze, my hands trembling as I strained my ears, hoping I'd imagined it. But the growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees on the other side. My pulse raced, dread creeping up my spine as I tried to locate the source of the noise. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure emerged, silhouetted against the gloom, standing atop a large boulder on the opposite bank. My heart skipped a beat, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with a thick, ape-like body covered in shaggy hair that seemed to absorb the dim light. It stood there, motionless, just watching me. I couldn't make out any distinct features, only its hulking outline, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. Panic seized me. I bolted back to my tent, fumbling for my machete, the only weapon I had. Clutching it with shaking hands, I turned back to face the river, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. The creature hadn't moved, but its growls intensified, deep and furious, as if I'd trespassed on its territory. The sound reverberated through the darkness, primal and angry, echoing off the trees and sending chills down my spine. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip on the machete slipping as the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, with no one around for miles, no chance of anyone hearing my screams if things went south. The creature growled again, louder this time, and in that instant, I knew I was done for. I felt myself go numb, the machete slipping from my hand and landing on the ground with a dull thud. But then, to my shock, the creature stopped growling and simply sat down on the boulder, its dark, glistening eyes fixed on me across the river. It seemed curious, almost like it was waiting for something. My mind raced, and in my desperation, I remembered the leftover fish and rice from my dinner. Slowly, my movements careful, I reached into my pot and grabbed a handful of the cold leftovers. Heart hammering, I tossed the food across the river, the chunks landing a few feet from the creature. For a tense moment, nothing happened. The creature just sat there, watching me, and I feared I'd made a grave mistake. But then, with slow, deliberate movements, it rose from the boulder and descended toward the water, sniffing the air before lowering itself to inspect the food. I held my breath as it began to eat, tearing into the fish and rice with an intensity that was both animalistic and strangely calculated. I took this moment to back away, my eyes locked on the creature as it feasted on my offering, hoping it would be enough to satisfy whatever dark hunger had brought it here. I could feel my legs shaking, every fiber of my being urging me to run, but I stayed put, too terrified to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the creature finished eating, wiping its clawed hands on the damp grass before standing up. It looked at me one last time, those eyes unreadable, before turning and slinking back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as silently as it had come. I stayed there, frozen in place, even after it had gone, unable to process what had just happened. I wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination, a figment of my imagination brought on by isolation and fear. But the empty pot and the disturbed grass where it had sat were proof enough. I didn't sleep a wink that night, sitting by the river with my machete clutched in my hand, listening to every creak and rustle until the first light of dawn. When morning came, I packed up and left without a second thought, not daring to look back at the boulder or the dark woods beyond. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered that night. It was no animal I'd ever heard of, and certainly not one known to these parts. Whatever it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined in my worst nightmares. The thought of that creature, the size, the growl, the dark, watchful eyes, still haunts me. A memory that lingers, impossible to shake. I still remember that day as if it happened just yesterday. It was the summer of 1967, and I was only 17, growing up in a small, sleepy village nestled in the thick green mountains of Mizoram. My friends and I would often walk down to the riverbank to wash clothes, a chore we had learned to make bearable with laughter, stories, and our favorite songs. On this day, though, that laughter turned to silence, and the memories are ones that chill me to my core. It was just after midday when we arrived at the river. The sunlight shimmered on the water, bouncing off the smooth stones at the river's edge, and the scent of wildflowers mingled with the earthy smell of wet rocks. My friends, Pari and Mimi, didn't have much to wash that day, so they quickly finished up and decided to go upstream to explore. I was left behind, wrestling with an embarrassingly large pile of clothes. I remember feeling a bit annoyed. There I was, elbow deep in suds, while they were off wandering the picturesque riverside, laughing and calling to each other. As I scrubbed away, I began to feel something, an uncomfortable awareness prickling the back of my neck as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. The air around me seemed to grow colder, despite the midday sun. I forced myself to shake it off, attributing it to nerves. After all, there were only dense clusters of trees and stones across the river, and I saw no sign of anyone nearby. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at me, an uncomfortable weight pressing on my chest. Just as I began to relax, a rock splashed into the water a few feet from me. My heart leaped. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the far bank. There, standing in front of an enormous gray-brown boulder, was a creature I will never forget. It was monstrous. Easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular build that seemed to blend with the rocky backdrop. Its skin was rough and mottled, the same grayish-brown as the boulder behind it, making it almost invisible. But what seized my gaze and froze me in place was its head. It had only one enormous, unblinking eye, set in the center of its forehead. Below that single, dark eye was a wide, thin mouth, stretched in a way that seemed like a twisted grin. The creature was bald, and in the stillness that followed, It seemed to exude a strange, menacing energy. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, coming out as a strangled gasp. Then, as if suddenly finding strength, I let out a piercing scream, louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. The creature remained motionless, staring at me with that eerie, emotionless eye. Within moments, I heard footsteps pounding behind me, and my friends' frantic voices calling my name. They rushed toward me, eyes wide with alarm. I was gasping for breath, my hands shaking so badly that I couldn't even point properly. I pointed wildly in the direction of the creature, but when we looked, the riverbank was empty. The boulder was there, unassuming and silent, as if nothing had ever stood before it. Mimi and Pari exchanged puzzled, worried glances, asking me what I'd seen. I stammered, struggling to put words to the horror I had just witnessed. A creature? A troll? An ogre with one eye? Nothing I said made sense to them. They hadn't seen anything, nor had they heard a sound other than my scream. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that encounter clung to me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, especially near the river, haunted by that lone eye that had watched me so intently. Even today, when I close my eyes, I can see it, looming large in my mind. Some people said it was a trick of the light, that I had simply imagined it, but deep down, I know it was real. What it was, I may never understand, but in the quiet hours of the night, the memory reminds me that there are things out there in the world, things that defy all reason, things that watch us even when we think we are alone. The morning chill of Shillong clung to us as David and I kicked up gravel on the winding roads out of the city, our motorcycles humming through the mist. Our bags were heavy with fishing gear and a couple of tents, just in case we decided to camp out by the river. We were headed to a secluded spot on the outskirts, a place known for its calm waters and, supposedly, good fish. 2 hours later, we rolled up to the riverbank, thrilled to have beaten the sunrise. The river was smooth as glass, catching the dawn light as it began to filter through the clouds. We didn't waste time and got our lines in the water right away, setting up a little downstream from each other. The morning passed slowly, no bites, not even a nibble. Then, as if to mock our patience, the sky darkened, and out of nowhere, the heavens opened up. The rain came down in sheets, soaking us before we had time to set up any decent shelter. Hastily, we rigged up a makeshift tent, really just a tarp overhead, but it was enough to keep the worst of it off. The hours ticked by with no sign of the rain letting up. David and I cracked open some beers, swapping stories and laughing over old memories, watching the river change from a clear stream to a muddy, churning mess. There was something about that rain. It was relentless, almost unnatural in its intensity. By the time it stopped, evening was already creeping in, and the air felt strangely still, as though the storm had stolen every sound around us. With only a bit of light left, I decided to try my luck upstream, giving the river one last shot before we called it a day. David stayed downstream, and we kept a bit of distance to cover more ground. I was just beginning to settle into a rhythm when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow. It was the silhouette of a man walking toward me from upstream. Just another fisherman, I thought. It was common enough to see people out here, trying their luck with the fish. He came closer, and when he was just behind me, he spoke in a low, almost raspy voice. "Are they biting?" Without turning, I shook my head. "Nah, no luck today. Rain didn't help." I waited for him to say something else, but there was only silence. A second later, David's voice startled me from behind. "Dude, who were you talking to?" I turned to look at him, my brow furrowed. "The guy who walked up just now asked if the fish were biting. Didn't you see him?" David's face went pale. "There was no one there. But I heard you talking to someone. I thought you were on the phone with the speaker on." He looked around, scanning the darkening woods and the river's edge, clearly uneasy. I felt a strange chill creep up my spine as I realized he was serious. I glanced back to where the man had been, and the feeling that we weren't alone sank in. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" Only the river responded, its murky waters rushing by, indifferent and ominous. David and I searched the area for a good 10 minutes, calling out, walking up and down the bank, but there was no trace of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. A shiver ran through me, and without a word, we both knew it was time to go. We packed up our things in record time, threw everything on our bikes, and rode out of there, not daring to look back. As we left, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowed figure standing on the riverbank, watching us disappear into the night. We never spoke of it again, but even now I wonder who I had been speaking to on that rainy evening by the river.